What's up guys, this is VinylicPuma, and given that we're closing in on the third year after Fallout 4's initial release, I think a lot of fans are expecting a new Fallout game to come out relatively soon. After all, Fallout 3 released in 2008, and while it's a spin-off, Fallout New Vegas released just 2 years later in 2010. So I think it's fair to say that we might actually be overdue for another game in the Fallout franchise. While we can't be sure if this new game will be Fallout 5 or a spin-off like Fallout New Vegas was, we should be getting a new Fallout game relatively soon. After all, I don't think Bethesda can announce another re-release of Skyrim or just a re-release of Fallout 4 at this year's E3. With this in mind, I figured it would be a good opportunity to talk about some new things that I would like to see in the next Fallout game. So in no particular order, let's go ahead and start with the first thing I'd like to see, and that is a brand new, entirely unexplored region. A lot of the Fallout games so far have either taken place on the American East or West Coast, and I think the next game in the series would greatly benefit from a brand new setting or location. Imagine if the player could traverse the radioactive forests of a post-war Ohio, Kentucky, or Tennessee. Alternatively, the Gulf regions of Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, and Florida could also prove to be a great and interesting change in scenery, as these areas are typically known for their swamps and other similar subtropical environments. Or maybe if Bethesda is really adventurous, a post-war Alaska could prove to be an interesting setting with its extreme cold and snow-covered environments. As I said, the settings for the main series of Fallout games have mostly just been deserts or arid wastelands. While Fallout 4 did have some interesting environments and even incorporated some of the areas I've mentioned, like how Fallout 4 includes a swamp, I would really like to see something that we just haven't seen before, and I think having a game take place in an entirely unexplored region of the United States would be really great for the franchise. Another thing that I'd like to see is a more sophisticated climate and weather system. After all, something that I always thought was kind of interesting about Fallout 4 was that the Pip-Boy records the specific date, month, and year in addition to the in-game time. So provided enough days have passed, you could perhaps be playing the game in December, or you could be playing the game in either March or April, where the weather would surely be different. However, in Fallout 4, while months or even years could pass as you play a particular save file, there's not really any discernible changes in climate. Sure, maybe there are a couple of times where it rains in-game or you encounter radstorms, however, seasonal weather never seems to occur. With this in mind, I think it would be really cool if the next Fallout game incorporated a seasonal weather system built into its gameplay. Perhaps during certain months, the player might be more likely to encounter snow, or maybe during other months, the player might see trees start to leaf out and turn green. To go along with this, what would be really cool is if certain types of animals only came out at certain times of the year. Perhaps Yao Guai would disappear in the winter, while other creatures like Deathclaws could be persistent throughout the year. Additionally, the weather system could have a great effect on survival mode. Perhaps the player would get dehydrated much more quickly in the summer months, while they would constantly have to fight off the cold and frostbite in winter months. Having to combat the environment in addition to whatever threats are out there could lead to some really tense combat situations and require the player to engage in strategies that they might not be engaging in otherwise. So even if the next Fallout game doesn't go to a new region, I think having dynamic scenery as of the result of a seasonal weather system would definitely make the game not only more visually appealing, but could also present unique gameplay that the series hasn't seen before. Something else that I think we would all like to see is some expansion and elaboration to Fallout's lore. After all, Fallout 4 added a lot of things to the pre-established lore without really explaining it. For example, the T-60 armor was never featured in the games before Fallout 4, and there's simply not a whole lot we really know about it compared to other armors like T-51 and T-45. Also, Fallout 4 introduces the new Gunner faction, but doesn't really elaborate on them all that much, despite the fact that the Gunners are like one of the Minutemen's key nemeses. Something else that would be nice to see is some additional explanation to some of Fallout 4's retcons. For example, one of the more infamous retcons was to the post-war drug jet, which was originally developed by Myron in Fallout 2, only to become a pre-war drug in Fallout 4. What I find interesting about this retcon in particular is that Jet actually has some of its origins in the pre-war period because meat companies were experimenting with a protein extract that got contaminated and ultimately became more like an amphetamine. What I'm getting at is it seems like there is a plausible link between having Jet in the pre-war period and then also having it in the post-war period and having it being developed by Myron. Or perhaps Myron just remade the original drug formula from the pre-war period and got credited with inventing it. Ultimately, I think going back and tidying up a lot of the continuity between all of the games would be really good, because Fallout 4 did change a lot of things, and it would be nice to see some of the things that were changed simply be explained. This next thing should really go without saying, but the next Fallout game should have a lot of new weapons. While Fallout 4 greatly improved the series' shooting mechanics, it was fairly lacking in the weapons department, especially when compared to New Vegas. For example, there are about 9 or 10 pistols in total in Fallout 4, while in New Vegas, there are just 11 ballistic pistols, and there are 18 if you include all of the uniques. Once you start adding the rest of the energy pistols in New Vegas, you've got well over 30 pistols to blow enemies to smithereens with. In Bethesda's defense, while I suppose weapon customization did end up covering the need for a lot of different weapons in Fallout 4, I don't really see how the next Fallout couldn't offer more than just 2 revolvers and 1 or 2 semi-automatic pistols with a lot of different or even similar customizations. The sheer weapon variety in New Vegas was one of the things that it did extremely well, and if the next Fallout game is going to be a spin-off of Fallout 4 in the same engine, I don't really see how a bunch of new weapons couldn't be added. While we're on the subject of weapons, something that I would personally like to see are some more interesting customizations for weapons, armor, and gear than what we saw in Fallout 4. In Fallout 4, what we saw for the most part were customizations that would mostly just improve stats or add additional attachments. For example, most of Fallout 4's weapon receivers would usually just increase damage or allow for automatic or semi-automatic fire. Thus, when choosing a receiver, it's more about choosing the one with the highest base damage possible. What would be cool is if the next Fallout game incorporated more attributes into the weapon's receiver. Maybe you could get a high damage receiver that's hindered by firing supersonic or just loud projectiles, making it a poor choice for stealth. Conversely, you could get a subsonic receiver that fires slightly weaker projectiles that are much quieter, making them better for stealth. To be fair, I think Bethesda have already started on this path of incorporating cool new gear customizations by allowing power armor to have jetpacks in Fallout 4. Something that I think would expand on this would be to have quote-unquote intelligent power armor that can operate independently of the user and respond to commands like the robots added with Automatron do. Perhaps we could see something similar to what you might see in Titanfall, where the player's Titan can operate independently or codependently with the player, which would present some interesting and new gameplay mechanics for Fallout's power armor. Regardless of what's implemented, I'd definitely like to see some new customizations to gear, weapons, and armor that really change up and expand upon what was already introduced in Fallout 4. Something else that I'm sure a lot of players have wanted for a long time is to have drivable vehicles in the Fallout games. Skyrim sort of experimented with vehicles by allowing the player to acquire a horse that they could use, but never really went much further than that. After all, you can't really ride and tame dragons in Skyrim unless you download a bunch of mods, which is kind of a shame if you ask me. That's why I sort of find it baffling that Fallout 4 didn't have any drivable vehicles. After all, cars in Fallout 4 are literally everywhere, and what's stopping the player from potentially fixing one up and using it? Additionally, I also find it weird that you can't ride in a vertibird to various locations across the Commonwealth, but you can't physically drive the vertibird, and I've also got to say that that's pretty weird. Now, I've heard in the past that Bethesda doesn't include vehicles in their games due to some of the technical limitations with the creation engine. Supposedly, the games don't include cars in particular because the game world can't load fast enough in order to accommodate a vehicle that would be, I guess, moving at such a high speed. Even still though, having some vehicles that move slower would be a nice inclusion into a Fallout game in my opinion. Something like an RV where the player can sleep or resupply on the go would be really cool to have. Or the ability to actively own and fly your own vertibird would be an amazing inclusion to the next game, and I think Bethesda could be forgiven if there was a little pop-in here and there. Hopefully, we'll see vehicles like this in the next game, as there are currently a lot of mods that are trying to incorporate vehicles into Fallout 4 right now. But let's talk about the settlement system. While I have to admit that I'm not as crazy about Fallout 4's settlement building system as others are, there are some things that I really do like about the settlement system. For example, the idea that you can build your own base of operations or build up your own army is actually a pretty cool idea, and is the part of the settlement system that I personally really like. However, instead of building settlements with only 1 or 2 factions like in Fallout 4, I hope the next game allows us to build settlements and forts with more than one of the factions that appear in the game. For example, what would be really cool is if you could build a Brotherhood settlement if you choose to side with them. Or maybe you could build a settlement for another corresponding faction if you decide to side with that particular faction. I also think if the settlement system was better integrated into the next Fallout game, it would be more focused, and thus, it could be less of a turnoff to people that didn't like the settlement system in the first place. Mods like Sim Settlements have been quite popular on the PC, and I also think if acquiring new settlements and expanding and conquering new territory is a big part of the next Fallout game's settlement system, then I think a lot of fans that didn't like the settlement system initially could end up liking it in the next game. Ultimately, making some key improvements to the settlement system by allowing you to build for more than just one faction, and instead of it just being this pretty open-ended settlement building mode, I think if it was just overall more focused and more integrated with the game's campaign, a lot more people would find it to be more interesting. Now, this last thing that I want to talk about is really going to be the lowest thing for the short term. However, I do think that long term, Fallout, The Elder Scrolls, and whatever other projects Bethesda Game Studios are currently working on would greatly benefit from a brand new engine. While I understand why Bethesda has mostly retained the older engine because of the fact that their games are easier to mod with the current engine, and it's also extremely expensive to develop a brand new engine, I do think that their games would greatly benefit from the upgrade. With the new engine, you could get better graphics, smoother animations, and potentially even improved loading times on the console versions. We might even get to witness more large-scale battles with hundreds of NPCs on screen at once, which would especially help the close-quarters medieval combat of the Elder Scrolls series and could make for some pretty interesting large-scale battles in Fallout 4 as well. While I will admit that Bethesda doesn't need a new engine immediately, especially if the next Fallout game is a spin-off, I do think that Bethesda's games would greatly benefit from a new engine long term. After all, Fallout 4 is almost 3 years old, while Skyrim is almost 7, and I think it's safe to say that Bethesda can't keep using the engine that they've been using for these past 7 to 8 years. So I would say that if the next Fallout is a spin-off and is still using the creation engine, sort of like New Vegas uses Gamebryo, Elder Scrolls 6 and Fallout 5 definitely need to be in a brand new engine. Alright guys, those are just 8 things that I would like to see. What are some of the things that you guys would like to see? Would you like to see a better dialogue system, or do you have something else in mind? Leave it in the comments below. Otherwise guys, like this video if you liked it, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.